About the last three videos, I've started by saying something like, "This text is one of my favorite texts." Today we're going to talk about the Acts of Thecla, and it's not one of my favorite texts. But that's not because it isn't interesting. It's fascinating. It's not one of my favorite texts because it's difficult. And it's difficult because of the subject matter. It's also difficult just because it's got a complicated history. This text originally belonged to a larger Acts of Paul, and it seemed to be one scene where Thecla was a part in this larger play. But it seemed to have taken on a life of its own. In fact, her relationship with Paul is still featured in the Acts of Thecla, and we have the first ever description of what Paul looked like. It's worth stopping and rereading it. Let me read to you what it says in the text. "And he saw Paul coming, a man small in size, bald-headed, bandy-legged or bow-legged, of noble mien, with eyebrows meeting and a rather hooked nose." But then it's kind of ends nicely. "Full of grace, the face of an angel." Now, there's actually a lot of symbolism in all of these things that would have been on their own. Any one description symbolizes something positive. But altogether, Paul's not all that attractive looking of a fellow here, and yet Thecla seems to fall in love with him. And I promise you, this is a love story. But before we get into that, let me just clarify that because this text has a life of its own, there are many iterations of it. I'm gonna have to oversimplify. Anything I say in this video may not apply to the whole life cycle of this text, but that doesn't need to slow us down for now. The point is, Thecla, who may have been a historical character, is put into this story that no historians think is accurate from the time of Paul himself. But it raises questions about how did second century Christians understand Paul's teachings. And so if Thecla was a real person, or if these stories have some basis in reality, we're past that now. We're trying to see what the stories tell us about the people who told them and who listened to these stories. And it's going to open up a few questions for us. So let's jump right in. Okay, one of the difficulties that I said is some of the content. And one of the main things contained in this text is the question of Thecla's role as a woman and gender roles. Now, talking about women's roles is not in and of itself a difficulty. The difficulty is translating what's going on in ancient Christianity and in this text to how do we compare that with how we think about women's roles today. So this is an incredibly complex conversation. I'm only scratching the surface because it needs to be addressed. But I say all of this to try to encourage you that you should think more about this and you should read more about this. There's tons of good studies that have come out in the recent decades on women's roles in early Christianity. But let me at least illustrate kind of how we should read a text like this. Because Thecla is featured here not just as a main character, but her femininity, her gender really takes center stage. She's a daughter who's betrothed to be married, and yet she bucks the system, and her father has no say over her, her mother has no say, society has no say. At the end of the day, not only is she left it all to follow this guy named Paul and his new teaching, she's actually dressing like a man and teaching others, and it's just bizarre to the people of this time. Now, when you take a step back from this text and look at other texts like Perpetua, there are some surprising things in them. And I say surprising because in one real sense, early Christianity has been criticized for how it treats women. And I'm not going to sweep this under the rug. This is a valid concern. It seems that when Christianity comes onto the scene, it says to women, welcome into the church, but now stay in your place. And your place is silent and out of sight. I mean, better yet, join a nunnery for the rest of your life. Now, the concerns there are valid, and I welcome talk about those. And again, we don't sweep those under the rugs, but texts like the Acts of Thecla, texts like the Passion of Perpetua, they sort of disturb that simple picture. They beg us to talk about other sides to the story. Thecla and Perpetua both are, in a sense, liberated from societal expectations. I mean, they're no longer really a daughter under their father's control. Thecla refuses to be married. Perpetua's husband, she's been married, but he's never even mentioned. He's not named at all.
they don't become mothers. Again, Perpetua's story is unique, but Thecla refuses to step into that role. And Christianity actually welcomes women to do that. Women are no longer bound by societal roles because in the ancient Greek and Roman world, there were hardly any public roles for them to play. Instead, Christianity allows people like Thecla to simply be Thecla. Thecla is a Christ follower who is liberated from all those societal roles, and you can see in a text like this, it upends society. People don't know what to make of this. So, as I say, it's a complicated issue. I know I've not done justice to it, but I hope that you can see that there are surprising instances where texts like this, ancient Christian texts, are perfectly happy, comfortable, tackling the issue, addressing the issue of women's roles head on. And Thecla is an interesting case study. Well, another difficult topic in this text is celibacy and singleness. And it's not difficult in and of itself. We shouldn't have a problem talking about that. It's challenging to translate what the early Christians were thinking and assuming and valuing to how we think of this today in modern Christianity. So let me just jump right in and read for you again what Paul says in this text, the Acts of Paul and Thecla. And remember, this is not, no historian thinks this is really Paul. This is what later Christians thought Paul was emphasizing. And we have these blessed statements, like what Jesus does in the Sermon on the Mount. But Paul starts off with one we know: "Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God." Now that's familiar to us because that's straight from Jesus. But then Paul turns these Beatitudes to all focus on one virtue in particular. Listen to what else he says. "Blessed are those who have kept the flesh chaste. Blessed are the continent. Blessed are, blessed are, blessed are." He ends with this idea: "Blessed are the bodies of virgins, for they shall be well-pleasing to God." Now, throughout the text, there's such an emphasis on this virginity that we quickly wonder, wait a minute, isn't it obvious this is not Paul? This is different from New Testament Paul? And I think we're supposed to ask that question. How does this compare to the real Paul, the canonical Paul? And I think we should start there. I think we should first clarify, what did Bible Paul, not Acts of Thecla, the real Paul, say about things like marriage and celibacy? Well, let's just look back at something for a moment. If you have your Bible, you probably want to open it up to 1 Corinthians 7 and follow along closely, because I'm going to spend some time here and make some clear observations so we can compare them. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 7, verse 8, "To the unmarried and the widows, I say that it is well for them to remain unmarried." You see, Paul, canonical Paul, prefers celibacy. But that's not all. He also permits marriage. Do you see what he says? Verse 9, "But if they are not practicing self-control, they should marry. For it is better to marry than to be," this translation says, "aflame with passion." The more literal, there's better to marry than to burn. I mean, yeah, Paul permits marriage, but he doesn't exactly endorse marriage. I mean, this is certainly no ringing endorsement. Marriage, he says, yeah, beats hell. Okay, maybe it's not burn in hell. Maybe a better translation is it burn with passion. So Paul permits marriage, but he clearly prefers celibacy. Now, if you go back to the Acts of Paul and Thecla, Paul actually never prohibits marriage in there. Now, you might get that impression, and he's accused of doing so, but by his enemies. You don't trust those guys. But what Paul actually does in Acts of Thecla is to permit marriage. He stays with people who are married. He's part of churches where people are married. He tacitly endorses that. But he prefers celibacy. So, are these two things equal? Acts of Paul and Thecla and canonical Paul, are they the same? Well, probably not, and we especially get worried when we hear Paul take some things to such an extreme. For example, here's one that usually stands out to us. If you go back to that list of blessedness, he says in one of them, "Blessed are those who have wives as not having them." Now, you know what that means, right? You have wives, but you don't have them. Okay, we're all big boys and girls, so no sex in marriage. And clearly, we all say, Paul would never say that. I mean, real Paul, canonical Paul. In fact, Paul seems to go out of his way to explain you should have sex in marriage, and you can't deny one another sex. In fact, it's worth looking back at 1 Corinthians 7 again. Let's read what Paul, canonical Paul, actually says. Paul, in verse 1 of chapter 7, is quoting what someone else has said. Someone, probably in Corinth, has said, it is well for a man not to touch a woman. Well, Paul doesn't agree with that for the married people. He adds in verse 2, because of cases of sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife, and each woman her own husband. And how he explains this is pretty clear. Verse 3 says, the husband should give to his wife her conjugal rights, and likewise the wife to her husband. For the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. No surprise he says that. Everyone in the ancient world thought that. But he goes on. Likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. That's incredibly shocking that he says that. No one in the ancient world thought that the wife had authority over the man's body. And he goes on, do not deprive one another except by agreement for a set time of devotion and prayer, and then come back together so that Satan may not tempt you because of a lack of self-control. So you see, he finishes in verse 7 where we were a while ago. I wish that everyone were as I myself am. That is, as Paul is. Paul is single. He prefers everyone to stay single, but he permits marriage, and he even permits people to have wives as though they do have them, and wives to have husbands as though they do that. He does permit sex within marriage. So it seems that what we looked at in the Acts of Thecla, where Paul says, have wives as though you do not have them, canonical Paul would never say that. This seems like the emphasis is so skewed towards celibacy that this text has gotten something off. Well, at the end of the day, I agree, but I want to point out the difference between these texts is a difference in degree, not a difference in kind. Let me go back through 1 Corinthians 7 and follow along, because after that opening part we just read, that's when we get to the paragraph where Paul says, I wish that everyone were like me, single. But if you want to be married, he allows marriages. And then he takes what seems to be a detour. Look at verse 17. 1 Corinthians 7:17, Paul says, let each of you live the life the Lord as a son, to which God called you. And that calling is going to be very important for Paul. Here, he goes on now, what seems the detour, to talk about circumcision versus uncircumcision. Verse 18 says, was anyone at the time of his call already circumcised? Let him not seek to remove circumcision. I'm not even sure that's possible. There are studies out there where this sort of thing tried to be hidden by ancient Jews, but this is not really something Paul thinks people can do. You can't undo circumcision. So if you're called circumcised, called to be a follower of Christ, remain circumcised. And he says the other thing that we all know Paul champions, if you're called and you are not circumcised, don't seek to be circumcised. Verse 20 finishes this paragraph up by says, remain in the condition in which you were called. Got it? So if you were Jewish and you started following Christ, remain Jewish. And if you're a Gentile and you started following Christ as a Gentile, you don't have to become Jewish. Stay a Gentile. Well, then he takes what seems to be another detour. Verse 21, were you a slave when called? This is where Paul doesn't sound so enlightened. He's not out to liberate slaves. He says, don't be concerned about it. And then he says to the masters, if you are called as a master, well, something like be a good master. But verse 24, in whatever condition you are called, remain there with God. Now, is Paul really talking about circumcision, uncircumcision? About slavery and being masters? Paul can't even conceive of a world where someone just snaps their fingers and they get out of slavery. Or a master, he can't conceive of a place where masters just don't have slaves anymore. But it seems he's not really talking about that, because verse 25 is where he comes back to the point he began the chapter with, what seems to be his real concern. Now concerning virgins. I have no command from the Lord, but this is the opinion I give. And he says again, verse 26, remain as you are. So you see all that talk about circumcised, uncircumcised, whichever condition you were called, slave or free, in whatever condition you were called. He's using these as illustrations of people who know if you become a Christian as a slave, they can't imagine being freed from that. That's not the point. The point is you're you remain in that state and still be a Christ follower. And now he says to those who are single, remain as you are. Are you bound to a wife? Do not seek to be free. Are you free from a wife? Do not seek a wife. But again, marriage is permitted. And then he says something very curious. In verse 29, he says, brothers and sisters, the appointed time has grown short. From now on, let even those who have wives be as though they had none. Wait a minute. Let those who have wives be as though they had none? This is canonical, Paul? Isn't that exactly what Paul says in the Acts of Thecla? And it is, verbatim. This is what we read and said, surely canonical Paul would never say that. But he did. And the question is, what does this mean? Now, clearly Paul starts off 1 Corinthians 7 saying that you cannot deny sex in marriage. Unless both parties agree it's for the season and purpose of prayer. And then if there's temptation, you must be willing to come back together. But Paul's preference is celibacy. That's the higher calling. And Paul's preference, even within marriage, is to have wives as though you had them not. Now, all of his reasons. Maybe it's because of persecution at the time. He believes Jesus is coming back any day. And what to do with that is a fair question. But I don't think those reasons in and of themselves let us just dismiss this. Every great Christian thinker throughout history thought Jesus was coming back any day now. And so this doesn't really change the equation. So what are we to make of this today in terms of Paul, canonical Paul or otherwise, calling for celibacy? But let me also talk about what this might mean individually for you and me. All the married people watching are probably sweating it out right now. Okay, here's what I'm going to say. I am married, happily married. I have 2 kids, and that's all I'm going to say about that. The rest is none of your business. I'm not saying all this to try to tell anyone what to do in their bedroom or explain what people are called to. In fact, if you're really interested in how this passage works, I think Augustine is the one who comes along and helps explain even more that Paul is not only talking about the state in which you are called, but where he began, back in verse 17, is the state to which you are called. And some people are called to be married and called to be parents, and some people are called to be single. And I'm not here to tell anyone their calling. Here's my main point with this. When we read things like the Acts of Thecla, it's so easy for us to just dismiss that and say, see, they didn't understand Paul. We understand Paul so much better, so they're clearly wrong. But sometimes it's important for us to pause and listen, because there may be things that these early Christians remembered about Paul's teaching or Jesus' teaching that's too easy for us to forget. I mean, it's way too easy for us in modern Protestantism, especially evangelicalism, to completely forget the preference that Jesus had for those who were single, that Paul had for those who were single. The preference for celibacy is real in the New Testament. And now the question is, when we're taught as good Christian boys and girls that every good Christian boy and girl grows up to be a Christian mommy and daddy, we're sort of stuck with a tough situation where we're not sure how to minister to singles. We're not sure about people who have a calling to something other than marriage and to parenting, and what do we do with people who don't fit into these roles? I mean, that's where I think that we have been at a bit of a loss. But I do think that it's too easy for us to just dismiss texts like this, and so I hope that this has been challenging, difficult, in a good way, making us listen closer to what Paul in the New Testament actually has to say about the role of singleness and the role of celibacy. All right, let me just pause one moment to set all of this stuff about celibacy back in the larger context of martyrdom. With Thecla, she's thrown into the arena, fed to the beast, and you expect her to die right there in a blaze of glory. Second baptism of blood. But there's a plot twist this time. It's not like Perpetua and Felicity. With Thecla, she's actually saved from the arena. And yet, she's twice in this narrative called a martyr. because she is still a witness. That's what martyr means. She is a faithful witness even to the end. Whatever that strange ending is, we'll come back and figure that out. But she is seen as a martyr because her whole life was one of martyrdom. And that's part of what this idea of celibacy as a higher calling seems to be with the early church. It is a death to self, to your own desires. Not everyone is called to it, but those who are live a life of martyrdom. And this shows up in countless ways in the early church. Voluntary poverty. Jesus says to his disciples, sell your possessions and give to the poor. We'll talk about that in a video later about Cyprian. Cyprian takes this literally and applies it to all disciples because all disciples are supposed to be martyrs. They're supposed to carry their cross, and that includes self-renunciation. And again, not everyone seems to be called to that sort of extreme life of poverty, and yet every Christian is called to a life of humility, of solidarity with those who are the least of these, and all of these different assets of being an athlete, being in training, of fasting and spiritual discipline and denying self. It's a life of martyrdom, whether that's in celibacy or other forms or all of the above, but all of this is part of these Christians understanding themselves to be athletes, soldiers, gladiators, fighting in the spiritual battle where they have denounced themselves in order to participate in Christ's victory over the world. Well, we spent a good bit of time there talking about Paul, comparing canonical Paul, but let's get back to the Acts of Thecla and Paul. What about Thecla? I thought we said this was a love story. Well, it is. We need to wrap this up, but let's do so by pointing out exactly what happens to Thecla in this story. Thecla was engaged. She hears Paul preaching, never sees him despite that description of him, and then she goes in pursuit of him through trials and tribulations, eventually finds him. At one point, she's at his feet, kissing his chains, and then she learns from Paul's teaching, but moves on past Paul. Well, what's going on in this story? Especially at the very end, there's this really weird, bizarre ending where these men are coming to Thecla, who's now old. Thecla, who at this point is actually teaching other people and living in a cave like a hermit, and people are coming to her for advice and counsel. And then these men come, these bandits, and they try to assault her. And she flees into the cave and into the rock. And the rock somehow closes. The end. Is she saved? Is she squished? What's going on here? Well, I think it helps to set this in the sort of literary context of a romance. And there are ancient romance novels. There's a number of surviving Greek novels that are about love stories, lovers. And they don't always follow the same plot. The plots can vary widely, but that's what makes it interesting. But they all sort of have some of the same common elements. It always involves two lovers. One's usually engaged to the wrong person, and then along comes another, the other lover, the true love of their soul, and they call it off. And this disrupts the family, this disrupts society, all the pressures that are put on these young people ends up in them having to flee from home. Usually one's trying to find the other, and they go here, yon, and there, and various trials and tribulations, usually arrested and misunderstood, eventually freed, sometimes attacked by pirates or bandits, but don't worry, the story always ends with the two lovers embraced in each other's arms, happily ever after. Now, is that what we have here? I mean, at first it seemed that Thecla was in love with Paul. But it turns out it's not Paul. Sure, she's infatuated with Paul, and sure, all these scenes where she's sitting at his feet, where she's kissing his chains, you're definitely supposed to feel uncomfortable in those moments. What's happening here? But the message is clear. Paul is teaching, preferring celibacy. Thecla has answered this call to celibacy. And when she finally finds Paul, when she finally escapes from the arena and sees Paul on his knees praying for Thecla, she doesn't actually fall on the ground and embrace Paul. Instead, she immediately lifts her arms to heaven and thanks her Lord Jesus. There's a scene where she looks up in the audience at one point and sees Jesus, but this is before she's been fully converted and fully baptized, she actually sees what looks to her like Paul. But the narrator explains it was actually Jesus cheering her on. You see, Paul, as it were, was the only Jesus she had ever seen. Paul was a Christ bearer, and what Thecla had actually fallen in love with was the Christ Paul was preaching. And so, yes, there at the end, these bandits come and they try to assault Thecla, but the story lives. The story ends where the two lovers are embraced in each other's arms happily ever after. You see, Thecla is in the Rock of Ages, cleft for me. She doesn't actually know our Baptist hymnal, but that is an image from Psalm 18:2, and she is clearly now in her lover's arms, and they live happily ever after.